Have you ever noticed how quiet your life becomes when you stop answering? Not out of anger, not as revenge, but because something deep inside you has changed. There was a time you would drop everything to help someone who never asked how you were. A time you responded instantly, even when your heart was breaking. A time you said yes, just to avoid being abandoned. You thought it was kindness, but it was fear dressed in politeness. Fear of rejection. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear that if you stopped being available, you would be forgotten. But something happened. Maybe it was a slow exhaustion. Maybe it was a silence that crept in like fog. Or maybe you finally got tired of bleeding for people who never once brought a bandage. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But what irritated you wasn't someone else? What if it was you? What if your own availability became the weapon used against your peace? They say the first sign of awakening is discomfort. And when you stop being available, the discomfort is everywhere. People get nervous. They say you've changed. They push. They poke. They test your silence. Because silence is power they don't know how to control. But you're not being distant. You're just no longer performing. You're not being cold. You're just done melting to make others feel warm. This is the beginning. The end of the old self. The one who existed only to keep others comfortable. And what comes next is the birth of someone they never expected. Someone sovereign. Someone still. Someone unavailable, but not lost. Unreachable, but finally found. You were taught that love meant availability, that being good meant being reachable, that being kind meant never saying no. So you smiled when you were exhausted. You picked up the phone when your heart was already heavy. You held space for others, even when you were sinking inside. But here's the truth. The world doesn't reward you for being endlessly available. It uses you. And the more you say yes, the more invisible you become. Not because you're not valuable, but because you're always there, always answering, always explaining, always reacting. And everything that's predictable eventually gets taken for granted. Carl Jung called it the persona. The mask we wear to be accepted. The version of ourselves we present to the world. Polished, pleasant, harmless. But behind that mask, something begins to crack. Because every time you abandon your needs for someone else's comfort, you leave a piece of yourself behind. And that empty feeling you can't explain? It's not loneliness. It's self-abandonment. The truth is, they didn't fall in love with you. They fell in love with your usefulness, your availability, your predictability. But what happens when you stop? When the person they used to call for validation, comfort, distraction, suddenly doesn't answer? They get angry. Not because they care, but because you broke the role they assigned you. And for the first time, they have to face themselves. You are not here to be someone's emotional vending machine. You are not here to be pressed, praised, or punished into being who they want. You are here to remember who you were before the world taught you to betray yourself for approval. The mask is slipping, and the world will not applaud you for it. But one day, you will look in the mirror and see someone honest, someone free. There is a kind of exhaustion that no sleep can fix, a tiredness that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. It happens when your energy is constantly escaping into places that don't nourish you. Every argument you didn't need to win, every message you felt obligated to reply to, every call you answered out of guilt. All of it. Psychic energy. Carl Jung didn't see your mind as a machine. He saw it as a living energy system. One that needs protection. one that loses power with every impulsive reaction. The world tells you, be responsive, be fast, be available. But your soul says, wait, watch, withhold. Because when your energy leaks out into every demand, every trigger, every person, you become hollow. You feel it when someone sends a passive-aggressive message, and your heart starts racing. Your fingers want to type back. Your thoughts spiral into imaginary debates. And even if you don't respond, they've already taken something from you. A piece of your peace. Jung said, that which you resist persists. And every time you react from the wound, you are feeding the thing that controls you. People who live emotionally drained aren't broken. They're unguarded. They've been taught to explain, to apologize, to serve as emotional furniture in someone else's life. And do you know what happens to someone who never says no? They become invisible until they snap. And when that snap comes, the world says, you've changed. But what really changed is that you finally decided your energy is no longer free. There is a danger in being the one who always understands, the one who forgives before an apology, the one who listens, even when no one asks how you're doing. Because that kind of goodness, the one born from fear, from guilt, from the terror of being alone, isn't virtue, it's survival. You became the fixer, the helper, the pleaser, not because you were strong, but because somewhere deep down, you believed that being useful was the only way to be loved. And so you kept showing up, even when they never showed up for you. You laughed at jokes that hurt. You stayed silent when your heart wanted to scream. You made yourself small so others could feel big. And the world called you nice. But it never called you safe. Because people don't protect what they use. They only protect what they value. Carl Jung said that the persona, the mask we wear to survive society, eventually becomes a cage. And one day you wake up, looking in the mirror, and you can't tell where the performance ends and where you begin. That's the danger of always being the good one. You lose the parts of yourself that were never allowed to speak. The anger, the boundaries, the honesty. You buried them so deep, you started to believe they were sins. But here's the truth. Your anger is sacred. Your silence is wisdom. Your distance is medicine. You don't owe the world an explanation for why you stopped performing. You owe yourself the truth of what it cost to keep everyone else comfortable while you suffered quietly. There comes a moment when the softest word becomes the sharpest blade. A moment when a single syllable, no, cuts through years of manipulation, guilt, and emotional blackmail. You don't scream it. You don't need to. You say it calmly, without anger, without shaking. And still, it echoes like thunder. Because for the first time, you are not asking permission to exist. You are declaring it. You see, people don't fear your rejection. They fear your clarity. They fear that they no longer have access to the version of you who bent, folded, explained, and apologized for simply being human. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." So what happens when what you do is nothing? When you don't chase, don't reply, don't defend, don't explain, you stop feeding the machine. And without your energy, the illusion begins to starve. That friend who always needed you to fix their mess, they vanish. That partner who only loved your submission, suddenly they don't recognize you. That boss who thrived on your silence, now they call you difficult. But what they really mean is, you're no longer useful when you refuse to break yourself for me. Let them be uncomfortable, because your no is not cruelty. It's closure. It is the funeral of your people-pleasing self, and the birth of someone who no longer sacrifices peace for proximity. And in that silence, in that refusal, in that stillness, you finally hear something you hadn't heard in years, your own voice. At some point, you have to accept the brutal truth. You were never meant to be everything for everyone. And yet, you tried. You became the therapist, the peacekeeper, the late-night call, the yes in a world full of people who only heard you when they needed something. You answered the messages, held space for breakdowns, forgave offenses no one even acknowledged. You poured until there was nothing left in you. And still, they asked for more. Why? Because you taught them that your availability was endless, that you would always be there, no matter how carelessly they treated you. But you see, even oceans dry when the sun never stops taking. Carl Jung warned of the danger of being consumed by the roles we play. He called it psychic inflation, when you over-identify with the mask and forget the soul underneath. And the cost? You wake up surrounded by people and still feel invisible. You laugh at the dinner table and wonder if anyone sees how tired you are. You keep showing up and slowly disappear in plain sight. This is what happens when you become a resource instead of a person. But there's a line, a final thread, and when it snaps, you don't announce it. You don't scream. You don't fight. You just stop. You log off. You step back. You become unavailable. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and the ones who once leaned on you suddenly panic. Not because they miss you, but because they lost access. Access to your attention, access to your care, access to your energy. But it's not your job to comfort them anymore. Your only job now is to return to yourself fully. It starts slowly. At first, they notice something is different. You're slower to respond, quieter in the room, less available for the drama you once absorbed like a sponge. They ask, "Are you okay?" You smile gently and say, "I'm just taking care of myself." That's when it begins. The discomfort, the whispering, the accusations. You've changed. You're distant. You're cold. You're selfish. But what they really mean is, you've stopped revolving around me. Because when you've always been the giver, healing will look like betrayal. To those who only knew you by what you gave, let them misunderstand you. You are no longer explaining the boundaries, meant to protect the energy you spent your whole life bleeding away. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And who you truly are is not a 24/7 lifeline for people who never learned to swim. You are not their emotional oxygen. You are not their crash mat. And if the price of your peace is their disapproval, then let them disapprove. You don't owe them your exhaustion. You don't owe them your breakdown. You don't owe them anything that costs you everything. Because healing is not always soft. Sometimes it looks like closed doors, left messages, silence instead of small talk, solitude instead of sacrifice. This is not rudeness. This is reclamation. The moment they call you selfish is the moment you know you're finally choosing yourself. And in doing so, you are, at last, becoming whole. There comes a day when you get tired of defending your silence, tired of justifying your distance, tired of explaining why you're no longer the person who dropped everything just to make others feel okay. You don't leave in anger. You leave in clarity, because somewhere deep inside, you realize If they needed an explanation to respect your peace, they were never truly listening anyway. Carl Jung believed that transformation begins when you stop living through the lens of how others see you and start living from the center of who you really are. And the truth is, every time you explain your boundary, you give someone the illusion that it's negotiable. Every time you over-explain your pain, you invite people to debate it. But your soul was never a debate. You don't need a PowerPoint presentation to justify your healing. You don't need a thesis to validate your decision to rest. You don't need permission to say, this no is final. When you stop explaining, something magical happens. You begin to be respected, not by everyone, but by the ones who matter, the ones who recognize strength in your silence, the ones who know that boundaries are a form of self-love, not rebellion. They won't ask for explanations. They won't guilt-trip you. They won't try to drag you back into the version of you that once said yes when you were dying inside. They'll simply say, I get it. And for the first time in a long time, you'll breathe. Not because they accepted your decision, but because you did. You used to be everywhere. A text away, a phone call away, the emotional first responder for everyone's chaos. You were present in rooms where you felt invisible. You stayed in conversations that drained your soul. You kept peace by betraying your own needs. And for a while, they loved that version of you. But the moment you pulled back, the silence was louder than your presence had ever been. That's when you learn something sacred. Your absence doesn't just create space. It reveals truth. It shows who misses you for you, and who misses the role you played in their life. It reveals the friends who respected your soul, and the ones who only respected your availability. It exposes the imbalance. How many of those you constantly held up have ever asked, how are you really? How many of those who called you strong actually listened when you were tired? Carl Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And when you go silent, they are forced to meet theirs. They lash out. They call you cold. They say you've become difficult, guarded, strange, but all you did was stop giving access to people who only ever knocked on your door when their own house was on fire. They're not angry you're distant. They're angry you're no longer available to be their emotional furniture. Your absence will teach them more than your presence ever could. And in the echo of that silence, you'll finally hear the only voice that ever mattered, your own. At first, the silence feels like punishment, like exile, like you've abandoned something or someone. You check your phone out of habit. You scroll through old conversations. You wonder, did I go too far? Did I change too much? And then you realize, this isn't loneliness. This is detox. You're not suffering because you're alone. You're suffering because for the first time in your life, you're no longer distracted. You're no longer numbing yourself with noise disguised as connection. Carl Jung called this the sacred solitude, the necessary retreat before rebirth, because only when you step away from the projections of others can you finally meet the person you've been all along, the strong one, the still one, the quiet force that never needed to explain herself to be whole. And in that quiet, you begin to feel again, not the pain of rejection, but the relief of no longer performing. You light a candle for yourself. You make tea with no one to impress. You read a book not to escape, but to remember who you were before the world got loud. And slowly, you begin to enjoy your own company. You stop apologizing for wanting peace. You stop shrinking to fit places that require your exhaustion. You stop bending into shapes just to be accepted by people who were never even looking at the real you. This is the solitude of the strong. And it's not empty. It's healing. Because from this stillness, something new is beginning to awaken. Something that doesn't depend on validation. Something that doesn't fear misunderstanding. Something that whispers, I am enough, even here. Even in the quiet. Even in the dark. Even when no one else is watching. The more you choose peace, the more you will lose people. And not just strangers. Not just acquaintances. Sometimes, the ones closest to you. It's one of the great paradoxes of awakening. You start to glow, and some begin to look away. Why? Because your growth exposes their stillness. Your boundaries threaten their control. Your silence reveals how loud their demands always were. You're no longer the emotional vending machine. You've stopped handing out explanations like candy. You've stopped letting guilt hold the steering wheel. And they start calling you selfish. But look closely. Are they angry at your change? Or are they angry that you no longer serve the version of them they forced you to hold up? Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Now you're no longer calling it fate. You're calling it out. You're naming the pattern. You're seeing the roles and stepping off the stage. You're not abandoning anyone. You're refusing to abandon yourself. And when they say, you've changed, say thank you, because they're right. You've stopped being the lifeline for people who never learned how to swim. You've stopped being the emotional landfill for unprocessed guilt, anger, and projection. You're not colder. You're cleaner. You're not cruel. You're clear. You're not distant. You're deeply rooted. And those who can't reach you anymore, they were never holding your hand. They were pulling your strings. So let them go. Let the ones who only loved your availability miss the depth they never cared to know. Let the noise fade. Because in that quiet, your real people will arrive. The ones who don't flinch at your stillness. The ones who see you, not for what you offer, but for who you are. And then, something shifts. Not in the world, but in you. You stop checking who stayed. You stop mourning who left. You stop explaining. You stop performing. You stop reaching out just to prove you're still worth being held. And in that sacred silence, you feel it. Not loneliness, not absence, but presence. Your own. The weight of it. The peace of it. The unshakable, undeniable clarity that you were never supposed to be everything to everyone. You were only supposed to be whole, to yourself. Carl Jung called this the individuation process. Becoming who you truly are by shedding every false self you created to survive. You are not the helper who is always available. You are not the hero who always sacrifices. You are not the mirror for other people's wounds. You are something much quieter, much older, much truer. A soul returning to its center. A heart no longer begging to be understood, but finally understanding itself. And yes, it's lonely, but it's the loneliness of strength. The kind that doesn't chase. The kind that doesn't cling. The kind that doesn't shrink just to be loved. Because now you love yourself enough to walk away from noise, to walk toward silence, to walk into a future where your peace is the price of entry. You will be misunderstood. You will be called distant. You will be told you've changed. But those are not punishments. They are signs. Markers of a life no longer dictated by other people's discomfort. This is your rebirth. This is your sovereignty. You are no longer available for guilt-soaked conversations, for drama disguised as love, for stories where your role is to bleed. You are now only available for what nourishes, what sees, what honors. You choose your silence like a crown. You wear your boundaries like armor. And now, you finally walk like someone who knows. Peace isn't something you find. Peace is something you no longer abandon.